So good day, everybody, and welcome to this online seminar organized by the Department of English and Communication, Hong Kong PolyU. So today, we're honored to have the speaker, Dr. Dave Cayado, um, to give us this talk. So Dr. Cayado is a British Academy postdoc research fellow in the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London. So his research looks at how morphologically complex words are processed and represented in the human mind and brain, with a focus on Tagalog, so his mother tongue. Using behavioral experiments together with neuroimaging techniques such as MEG and EEG, he looks at cognitive and neural mechanisms that support morphological decomposition across modalities. So Dr. Cayado, before joining Royal Holloway, Dr. Cayado did his PhD in neurolinguistics from Queen Mary University in London back in 2024. Um, and he also worked in Tagalog morphology to test the flexibility and generality of morphological processing. Before that, he held a degree in Master of Philosophy in Psycholinguistics at the University of Hong Kong. So without further ado, so I will just pass the mic to Dave for the talk. So how human brain breaks words apart to understand them, insights from Tagalog morphology. Then please, Dave. Thank you.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to be here. I want to thank Dr. Bruce Wang for extending this invitation. So today I'll talk to you about how the human mind and brain process parts of words called morphemes. So in majority of the world's languages, words are not atomic. They are composed of smaller meaning-carrying units called morphemes. So for example, when we read the word refill, um, we have the prefix re and the stem fill. And in the case of teacher, we have the stem teach and the suffix er. So a lot of the words that we encounter in the languages that we know are composed of these morphological units. And our knowledge of morphemes is important because it provides access to the content-rich parts of the word. It provides access to the meaningful parts of words, which allows us to do two things. First, it allows us to estimate meanings of words we may not have seen before or we are unfamiliar with, like mistrustfulness, for example. It also allows us to create new words to suit our needs. So for example, in social media right now, you cannot use the word kill, otherwise your account might be banned. So Gen Z people use their knowledge of the prefix "un", which means the reverse of, and the stem "alive" to create the word "unalive" to mean that something or someone is not living anymore. So this ability to estimate meanings of unfamiliar words and to create new words increases our vocabulary by 7 times. And it has also been shown that our knowledge of morphology contributes to improving reading fluency, reading efficiency, as well as our spelling skills. Wait a minute. Right. So how do readers acquire knowledge of morphology? Based on statistical learning perspective, morphemes offer islands of regularity that readers can exploit in order to track the mapping between form and meaning. And it's this brain sensitivity to form meaning connection or form meaning mapping that builds representation of morphological knowledge. So for example, readers should be able to track that cleanly, cleaner, unclean, and cleanliness are all variants of the same word clean. Similarly, readers should be able to track that the in teacher, builder, singer, and banker all carry the same grammatical information, which forms agentive nouns. So teacher is someone who teaches, builder is someone who builds, singer is someone who sings, and banker is someone who works at a bank. So it's this ability to track or to connect this form to its meaning consistently that builds representation of morphemes in the human mind and brain. However, this form meaning mapping is not consistent at all. So for example, Dresser is not someone who dresses. It's a piece of furniture in this case. And smaller is not someone who smalls. In this case, it's a comparative adjective. So smaller means that a thing is smaller than another thing. And finally, the in brother and corner do not play any grammatical roles at all. So brother is not someone who brots, and corner is not someone who corns or more corn than another thing. And it's this inconsistency of form meaning mapping is actually reflected in the way we learn affixes. Specifically, it has been shown that affixes with more consistent meaning are easier to learn than those with less consistent meaning. And the take-home message is that readers develop representation of affixes if they occur frequently with many unique exemplars or stems like teacher, builder, singer, and banker. And once readers build representation or morphological knowledge, how do they use this knowledge in real time? Hundreds of studies in the last 50 years have shown that whenever we read morphologically complex words like teacher, we decompose them into morphemes. We call this process early decomposition, and this process is quite important because this is what allows us to access these meaningful parts of words and use this knowledge to estimate meanings of unfamiliar words. And studies using neuroimaging technique like magnetoencephalography have shown that this early decomposition process happens very quickly. So it happens within the first 200 milliseconds of seeing the word in a brain area called the left fusiform gyrus, particularly the visual word form area, which is responsible for orthographic processing. Now, we seem to have this general theory or model of how morphemes are processed in the human mind and brain. And this early decomposition process has been attested in hundreds of studies in the past 50 years. However, the main problem is that the existing models that we have not been tested in a wider variety of languages. So we do not know yet whether our model in our existing knowledge is actually general or universal in a way that it applies to speakers of other languages. This is a plot taken from a review article that I have with Cayado Rastle. It shows morphological processing studies published from 1975 to 2025. And our goal is to quantify how linguistically diverse morphological processing literature is. We have number of studies on the y-axis right here, and we have languages on the x-axis. And as you can see here, more than 40% of the studies were conducted in English, and about 60% were conducted in closely related Indo-European languages like French and German. Additionally, we also found that there is a morphological typology problem in the literature, as shown in this plot. More than 50% of the studies were conducted in suffixation. So what we know is based not just on one language, but also on one morphological type. And this makes sense because suffixation is one of the most dominant morphological types in highly studied languages like English. And this is a problem because other languages have different ways of forming complex words. So what we know from suffixation may not necessarily apply to speakers of other or to excuse me may not necessarily apply to other languages with unique ways of forming complex words. Ultimately, this combination of linguistic diversity and morphological typology problem raises an important question about universality. So is our existing knowledge or theories truly universal in a way that it applies to readers of other languages, or is what we know just a feature of a small subset of highly related languages? And if the goal of the field is to try to fully understand how the brain processes language, in this case, words, then it's imperative for us to go beyond this small subset of highly related languages. And in my research program, I do this by looking at a language called Tagalog or Filipino, which is an Austronesian language from the Philippines with around 80 million speakers. And Tagalog makes an important and an interesting test case because it has ways of forming complex words that are mechanistically different from suffixation in English. So looking at understudied languages like Tagalog, we don't do this for the sake of increasing diversity. We do this because looking at other morphological types allows us to ask newer and better questions about morphological processing. For my research program, there are two main questions that I ask. First, I ask how robust and flexible this early decomposition process is. And second, I ask what linguistic factors determine whether morphologically complex words will be stored and accessed as morphological units. For this particular talk, I want to talk to you about three different linguistic factors. The first one is edge alignment, followed by obscurity of morphological boundary, and then I'll talk to you about inconsistent surface forms. And by the end of the talk, I want to show you how we can revise existing models of morphological processing to account for this new set of data from an understudied language. Let's talk about edge alignment first. So, in a recent model by Beyersman and Granger, they proposed that words like teacher are subject to decomposition because all potential pieces are at the edge of the letter string. So the stem teach is in the left edge, and the suffix is in the right edge, which makes them highly visible, which then makes decomposition possible. In this case, based on this proposal, words like teachers will no longer be subject to decomposition because is now in the middle of the letter string. So it's between two morphemes. Similarly, something like unteachable will no longer be decomposed because the stem teach is now in the middle of the letter string. So it's mid-embedded. And this means that based on this proposal, a lot of morphologically complex words will no longer be subject to decomposition because they're no longer highly visible. So I want to test this proposal looking at something like Tagalog. So we have words here like tinawag and tinali. Tinawag meaning called and tinali meaning tied. So these are examples of infix words. So infixes in Tagalog, like in, are inserted before the first vowel of the letter string. So the stem here is tawag, the stem here is tawag, and the infix in is inserted before the first vowels. So this resulted in tinawag. Similarly, something like tinali, the in is inserted before the a. So we have tinali, meaning tied. So the critical thing here is that none of the morphemes are at the edge of the letter string. So the stem, tawag, and tali are broken into two pieces. So they are outer embedded now, and the infix in is within the letter strings. So both morphemes are not as visible as the cases in English. And based on Beyersman and Granger's proposal, these words should not be subject to decomposition because none of the morphemes are at the edge. And what makes Tagalog a really interesting test case is because the infix in has a prefix variant ni that only appears for L, W, Y, H, and N initial stems. So in and ni are allomorph, so they are exactly the same morpheme, marking the same grammatical information, which is perfective aspect. But one of them is within the letter strings, like in the case of tinawag, but one of them is in the edge of the letter strings, like in the case of nilason, meaning poisoned. We also have the suffix in, like in the case of sapakin, meaning to punch someone. The important thing to note here is that the in suffix in Tagalog is not exactly the same morpheme as the infix in because they mark different grammatical information. So they're not allomorphs, they're not variants of the same um, morpheme, but they have the same surface form in. So it still makes a really close comparison. So one is an infix, there it's in the middle of the letter strings, and one is edge aligned. So in Tagalog, we can do this three-way comparison in order to ask whether edge alignment hampers early decomposition. So if Beyersman and Granger, if both of them are right, then prefix and suffix conditions should be subject to decomposition, but the infix condition should not be subject to decomposition. And to answer this question, I use a paradigm called mass morphological priming, which has four main elements. So it starts with a fixation cross for 500 milliseconds right here, followed by the mask for another 500 milliseconds, and then the prime is presented for 33 milliseconds. So it's so quick that participants are not even aware that it was there. So it's subconsciously presented to participants. And then the target word is presented, and upon seeing this, participants had to do a lexical decision task. So they have to judge whether this target word is morphologically is a real word in their language or not by pressing the corresponding button. Now, the critical aspect of this paradigm is that the prime can be morphologically related to the target word, like tinawag and tawag share the same stem morpheme, or it can be completely unrelated to the target word, like bombero and tawag. So bombero meaning fireman, and then tawag meaning call. And the common finding across hundreds of studies in the last 50 years is that participants' responses to the target word become significantly faster when it's preceded by a morphologically related prime as compared to when it's preceded by a completely unrelated prime. We call this priming effects, and in this context, priming effects are taken as evidence supporting decomposition. The main assumption is that participants' subconscious encounter of the prime word like tinawag um, is enough for them to decompose this word into morphemes in and tawag, activate those pieces in the brain. So when they see the word again as a target word, then it becomes faster and easier for them to respond to that word. So in this 2023 study that we have reaction time on the y-axis and then prime type on the x-axis right here. By prime type, I mean rel stands for related and unrel means unrelated. And as you can see here, native Tagalog speakers responded significantly faster when the target word is preceded by a morphologically related prime as compared to when it's preceded by a morphologically unrelated prime. And we call this priming effects. And priming effects in this study were observed for the prefix, infix, and suffix conditions. And the magnitude of priming effects um, are similar across, are not significantly different across the three conditions. So what this study tells us is that edge alignment is not a critical factor that determines stem activation. So Tagalog speakers or readers were able to activate the stem in Nilason, Tinawag, and Sapakin with similar level of ease, even though in the case of Tinawag, the stem is not edge aligned because it's broken into two pieces. However, what I want to emphasize in this study is that it only looks at stem activation because the prime and the target, the morphological relationship that they share is based on stem morpheme. So it can only tell us how stems are activated. So whether affixes itself or affix activation is the is hampered by edge alignment remains an empirical question, or it hasn't been addressed um, by this particular study. So we conducted another study, another experiment to test whether edge alignment hampers affix activation. Specifically, we compare how in Tinawag and ni in Nilason are activated, or whether they are activated at a similar level of ease or difficulty. Additionally, we included this condition where um, the infix is attached to glottal stop initial stems. So in Tagalog, the glottal stop symbol is never written, so it's not part of the writing system. So even though phonologically it's an infix, orthographically or visually, this appears in the left edge or in the prefix position. So it's actually edge aligned if we're doing a visual experiment. So to conduct this study or to investigate whether edge alignment matters during affix activation, we have these two these two conditions. The first one is glottal infix condition, where the prime and the target share the same infix in the left edge position, like inayos and inubos. We also have the ni prefix condition, where the prime and the target share the same ni prefix condition, like ninakaw and nilusak. And finally, we have two infix conditions. So in the case of in infix, the prime and the target share the same in infix, like in binago and sinuway. So this is not edge aligned. And finally, we have the infix condition, where the prime and the target share the same infix, like tumawa and sumama. So again, this is not edge aligned. And the prediction is that if affix activation is constrained by edge alignment, then the green conditions should be should have priming effects, but not the in and infix conditions. So let's talk about the significant results first. So again, we have reaction time on the side and prime type at the bottom. So we have related and unrelated at the bottom. As you can see, we found significant priming effects for the glottal infix condition, where the prime and the target share the same in infix in the left edge position, like inayos and inubos. And then we also found significant priming effects for both and for both in and infix conditions, like in binago, sinuway, tumawa, and sumama, even though these infixes are not at the edge of the letter strings. So based on these three conditions, we provided evidence that edge alignment is still not a critical factor when activating affixes. However, as you can see here, we didn't get any significant priming effects for the ni prefix condition. So this is when the prime and the target share the same ni prefix, like ninakaw and nilusak. And there are many reasons for this that I will explain in the next few slides. So based on behavioral data that we have from these two studies, we have compelling evidence showing that early decomposition takes place regardless of edge alignment. So this alone contradicts this recent model of Beyersman and Granger arguing that edge alignment determines whether words will be decomposed or not. So it looks like when Tagalog readers read something like nilason, tinawag, sumuway, inayos, and sapakin, they were able to decompose this into morphemes and activate these pieces in the human mind and in the brain. In the case of the two infix conditions like tinawag and sumuway, we have evidence that they were able to activate the stem, tawag, and suway, even though it's broken into two pieces. And they were also able to activate in and um, infixes, even though it's within the letter string. So this shows us that edge alignment does not matter at all. Um, and the way these infixes are activated are not significantly, it is not more difficult than activating something like inayos. For example, where in is in the left edge of the letter strings. However, as you can see here, it seems to be the case that native Tagalog speakers find it more difficult to activate the ni prefix. And that can be because of frequency and variability. So as you can see here, the ni prefix is much less frequent than its in infix variant. So you can see the frequency count here. So it might be the case that native Tagalog readers are not exposed well enough to this ni prefix in order to activate it very quickly in the context of mass priming, where the word is only presented for 33 milliseconds. So it might be the case that they need more time in order to activate this prefix. And also, the occurrence of the ni prefix is variable. So sometimes nilason is acceptable, but linason is also acceptable. So seeing this affix as a prefix sometimes as an infix sometimes could have made it more difficult for native Tagalog speakers to track this piece during early decomposition. So now that we have evidence showing that edge alignment does not matter, I want to talk to you about obscurity of morphological boundary. So based on the study of Tang and Witzel and McCormick et al. 2008 and 2009, words like adorable and sanity are subject to decomposition, even though both of these cases have deleted E in the stem. So adore has a deleted E and sane has a deleted E. And in the case of sanity, there's also a vowel change from sane to sanity. So these studies show us that orthographic and phonological information um, or orthographic and phonological changes do not negatively impact decomposition. However, these studies also argued that morphological boundaries must still be highly visible in order for decomposition to happen. So in the case of adorable, you can still see where the stem ends and where the suffix starts. Same with the case of sanity, you can see where the stem ends and where the suffix starts. And you can exploit this morphological boundary in order to trigger decomposition or to do decomposition easily. So based on this proposal, when the boundary between the two morphemes are no longer visible, then decomposition will break down. It will not happen. So I wanted to test that in this study using, again, Tagalog, because when we combine velar final prefixes like mang and pang to an obstruent initial stem, there are two possible morphophonological alternation or changes that can happen. The first one is nasal assimilation. So for example, mang plus bulag becomes mambulag. So the velar sound in the prefix or the ng becomes m in the prefix. So it resulted in mambulag. So now the identity of the prefix is a little bit more obscured. Nasal substitution is also possible. For example, mang plus tulak, meaning to push someone, becomes manulak. So in this case, the velar sound in the prefix and the initial consonant becomes one sound or one letter, N in the case of manulak. So these morphophonological changes are reflected at both orthographic and phonological levels in the language. So as you can see in the case of manulak, the identities of both the prefix and the stem are obscured and the boundary between them is no longer clear. So what I did in this study is I compared these three cases. So one where there is no morphophonological change at all, meaning the boundary is very clear, and the case where the boundary is clear, but the prefix identity is a bit obscured, and the case where the boundary is completely obscured, like in the case of Manulak, to test whether early decomposition remains robust and operational in the face of morphophonological alternation that obscure morphological units. And again, similar to the first part of the talk, I answered this question using mass morphological priming paradigm. And as you can see here, we have reaction time at the side and we have prime type at the bottom. So we have related versus unrelated. And as you can see, for no change, assimilation, and substitution condition, we found significant priming effects of similar magnitude across the three conditions, suggesting that the way early decomposition happens is at similar level of ease across the three conditions, meaning that early decomposition remains robust and operational, even though the morphological units are obscured and the morphological boundary in the case of substitution is also obscured. So this alone contradicts what McCormick et al. Had proposed in 2008 and 2009 studies. However, so far, I've only talked to you about studies that use mass morphological priming paradigm. So as I've explained earlier, in mass morphological priming, the measure of decomposition happens, or we recorded, this measure of decomposition is based on when participants make their lexical decision. So when they press the button. And as you can see here in this particular study, the button pressing happens around 700 to 900 milliseconds after seeing the word. And this is way later than when decomposition is supposed to happen. So in the very beginning of the talk, I mentioned that early decomposition happens within the first 200 milliseconds of seeing the word. So the studies that I presented to you so far um, is only telling us what happens when participants pressed the button. It does not only look at the early decomposition process that happens within the first 200 milliseconds of seeing the word. So to see whether that early decomposition process within the first 200 milliseconds of seeing the word is actually affected by obscured morphological boundary, we have to use a neuroimaging technique called magnetoencephalography or MEG. So MEG is a neuroimaging technique that records magnetic field from the brain, which are generated whenever neurotransmission happens. So whenever your neurons talk to each other, it produces a magnetic field that we can record from the scalp. And what's good about MEG is that it has really good temporal resolution that allows us to zero in or to focus our analysis within the first 200 milliseconds of seeing the word. And it also has a decent spatial resolution, which allows us to see which part of the brain is responsible for this early decomposition process. So in each trial, it starts with a fixation cross for 500 milliseconds, followed by the stimulus for 2000 milliseconds. And then upon seeing this, they have to judge whether this is a real word in their language or not. As you can see here, this particular experiment is no longer a mass priming experiment. It's a single word lexical decision task. So participants had to judge right away after the fixation cross whether this is a real word in their language or not. So how do we measure the composition in this particular experiment? We do that by quantifying morphological complexity and seeing whether the brain is sensitive to this measure of morphological complexity. So this measure of morphological complexity is called stem whole word transition probability. So it's the conditional probability of getting the whole word like mamundok given the stem bundok. So it's the quantification of the internal properties of words. So think of this as a measure of morphological complexity. So the main assumption is that if the brain is sensitive to this measure of morphological complexity, then it supports the existence of early decomposition process. So here's what we found. So we found this activation in the left fusiform gyrus. So this photo of the brain right here is the bottom part of the brain. So imagine you cut your head open and then you flip you flip the head, and then you're looking at it from the bottom. So we found this activation of the left fusiform gyrus, and we found that this activated area is significantly correlated to stem whole word transition probability from 130 to 180 milliseconds after seeing the word. So this shows us that the brain is sensitive to the measure of morphological complexity. Additionally, we also found a significant effect of base or stem frequency from 130 to 180 milliseconds. So these two sets of findings showed us that the brain is sensitive to internal properties of words, which then supports decomposition. And the fact that we found um, this correlation across the three conditions shows us that early decomposition remains operational and robust, even though the morphological boundaries and the morphological identity are both obscured by morphophonological changes. So what seems to be happening is that when Tagalog readers read something like ma, followed by m, followed by ng, m, or n, they immediately trigger decomposition because this is a reliable measure, or this is a reliable cue that the word is morphologically complex. So this is a reliable cue that the word is a prefix word that may have been nasal assimilated or nasal substituted. So upon seeing this, they immediately triggered decomposition, which resulted in successful decomposition of these prefix words, regardless of morphophonological alternations that obscure their morphological boundary. All right. So for the final experiment that I want to talk to you about, it's about inconsistent surface forms. So as I've mentioned in the very beginning of the talk, based on statistical learning perspective, knowledge of morphemes is formed by tracking the mapping between a consistent form and meaning. So for example, you build representation of the suffix ed because this form ed consistently map onto the past tense meaning. So talked, walked, dropped, and jumped are all in the past tense. So it's this mapping between a consistent form and meaning that allows us to build representation of morphemes, which then we can use during early decomposition when we become native readers of the language. However, in other languages like Tagalog, sometimes morphemes have no consistent surface form. So for example, we have these Tagalog verbs, sayaw meaning dance, tawag meaning call, jump meaning talon, and putok meaning explode. And if we want to indicate that these actions have not been completed yet, what we have to do is copy the first consonant and vowel of the stem and place this copy before the stem. So it resulted in sasayaw, tatawag, tatalon, and puputok. So the critical thing about reduplication is that all of these pieces are exactly the same morpheme with no consistent surface form. So if the previous predictions are right, then it might be more difficult to build representation of these kinds of words because there is no um, consistent mapping between a surface form and meaning. So to test whether that is actually the case, I conducted a masked priming experiment with two critical conditions. So the first one is stem repetition, where the prime and the target share the same stem. So tatawag is a partially reduplicated word as a prime, and then the target is just the stem tawag. But the more interesting part of this experiment is that we have the red, meaning reduplication. So this is reduplication repetition, where the prime and the target share the same reduplicant with no consistent form. So sa and ti are exactly the same morpheme with no consistent form. So their morphological relationship is at a more abstract level that haven't been investigated before. So if we do find evidence of priming effects for the red repetition condition, then it will be the first piece of evidence showing that early decomposition happens at a more abstract level beyond surface forms. And as you can see here, we found significant priming effects for both stem repetition condition and the red repetition condition, and the magnitude of priming effects are similar for the two, between the two conditions. And as you can see here, we found significant priming effects for the red repetition condition, even though sa and ti, the bold part, do not share the same form. So this tells us that early decomposition operates at a level beyond surface forms, and that Tagalog speakers were able to build representation of words even though it does not have a consistent mapping between a form and meaning. So perhaps what native Tagalog readers did is that they were able to exploit a mapping between a consistent form or a consistent, sorry, not consistent form, a mapping between a consistent pattern onto meaning. So the consistent pattern here is that a consonant and vowel is always copied and placed before the stem. So they were able to use that pattern to build their morphological knowledge and then use that to eventually do early decomposition when they become native users of the language. And we show in this experiment that this early decomposition happens at a more abstract level beyond surface forms, which haven't been investigated or attested before. Now, based on this new sets of data from Tagalog, how can we revise our existing models of morphological processing in the visual domain? So I want to show you a model that is heavily based from Beyersman and Granger's model that I talked about earlier, but now accounting for the data that we have for Tagalog. So it has several stages. So first, readers will see the orthographic input, and then these orthographic input will be subject to a flexible form-based full segmentation stage. So it's flexible because it allows decomposition even though none of the morphemes are edge aligned and none of the morphemes have visible morphological boundaries and they have no consistent form. That's why it's much more flexible than what has been previously proposed. So after this segmentation stage where morphemes are decomposed, we activate those um, pieces in separate stages, separate but concurrent stages of affix activation and stem activation processes, where the orthographic and phonological representation of words are activated. And if the words that they are reading went through orthographic or phonological changes, then these changes will be unpacked or undone in order to map the surface form onto its more abstract form in both orthographic and phonological levels. And then finally, you activate the meaning of those representation, the semantic representation of those morphological units. So this is a bit abstract at the moment, so I want to give a few examples. This is the case of infixation. So when Tagalog readers read the initial consonant followed by in, they immediately trigger decomposition because the consonant followed by in is a reliable cue that the word is an infix word. So because um, this pattern of letter strings typically only happens when words are infixed. So this immediately triggers decomposition, resulting in the segmented pieces in, which is the infix, and the broken tawag. Um, in this segmentation stage. And then these segmented pieces are then mapped onto its orthographic representation. And as you can see in the case of the stem, since this stage is flexible, it allows the mapping of the broken stem into its unbroken stem in the orthographic representation. And then since infix has a prefix allomorph, it also maps onto its into its ni prefix variant at the phonological level through unpacking this phonological readjustment that happened, in this case, onset metathesis. And then these activated pieces at the phonological levels are then mapped onto their semantic representation in order to access the meaning of the words read. Now, this is the case um, where the affix is much more difficult to activate, like in the case of the ni prefix. So, for example, when they read nilunod, it's segmented into ni and lunod, and the activation of the stem had no problem. So it just goes through the orthographic lexicon, followed by the phonological lexicon, and then the semantic representation, as attested in my 2023 study, since we found significant stem priming effects. So there shouldn't be any problem at this level of processing. However, we didn't get any reliable priming effects for the ni condition in the masked affix priming experiment. So it looks like ni is much more difficult to activate at this stage of processing because of frequency and variability. That's why it's put in red. But then again, I want to highlight that this doesn't mean that ni prefix words are not decomposed. Since stems are successfully activated, it's just the ni activation that has a problem, and that can be because of frequency, it's less frequent than the in infix. So it might be the case that they need more time in processing ni in order to activate it successfully. But then again, that's just a speculation. It's something that I haven't investigated before. And then we have a case where the prefix word went through nasal substitution. So for example, ma, when native Tagalog readers read something like ma, followed by M. This immediately triggers the segmentation stage because this letter sequences um, is a reliable cue that the word is a prefix word that may have been nasal substituted. So this resulted in the segmented piece ma and malo. And since this is a flexible segmentation stage, it allows mapping onto an underspecified orthographic representation ma and alo. And then because of unpacking the phonological readjustment in both stem and affix stages, it allows the mapping of the underspecified orthographic representation um, to its fully specified phonological representation like mang and palo. And then the semantic representation is then activated. Yeah, so finally we have the reduplication case. Upon seeing a reduplication like sa, Tagalog readers immediately trigger decomposition because this is a cue that this is a reduplicated word. So this resulted in the segmented piece sa and sayao. And then since in the affix activation process, it's a much more abstract level. There's not going to be a sa in the orthographic and the phonological lexicon, it's just CV or consonant vowel reduplication. So it allows mapping of the reduplicated word, even though it doesn't have a consistent surface form during the early decomposition process. And then the stem just goes through the other cases with no problem because it's just a stem with no phonological or orthographic changes. So to wrap up, what did we learn from Tagalog? So first, we showed that based on data from Tagalog, edge alignment is not a critical factor that determines early decomposition. Second, it looks like early decomposition remains robust in the face of obscured morpheme identity and obscured morphological boundary. And finally, early decomposition operates at a more abstract level beyond surface forms. So overall, um, what Tagalog data tells us is that morphological processing is much more robust and flexible than what has been previously observed in other studies and proposed in other models. And this is not something that we could have anticipated if we did not look at beyond a small subset of highly related Indo-European languages. So this is the beauty of cross-linguistic experimentation because it allows us to test um, whether our prediction in existing models actually hold up in a wider variety of languages. That's it. Thank you so much. Maraming salamat for attending this talk. I want to thank my funding sources, the British Academy and ESRC. And I also want to thank NYU Abu Dhabi for funding my neuroimaging studies. And I want to thank my co-authors and collaborators for all the studies that I presented to you today. Thank you.